They arguing his convictions should be tossed out. What exactly did his team say? How Sean Combs was back in court today arguing his convictions should be tossed out. What exactly did his team say? How did he look? What can we expect next? And by the way, this is all in anticipation of next week when he's going to officially be sentenced. Is that even going to happen anymore? And what will that sentence be? Could he be going to prison for the next few years? Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Talk about he is trying to get his convictions thrown out. Now, this is in advance of next week, where the rap mogul turned convicted felon is officially going to be sentenced on 2 charges of transportation to engage in prostitution. This comes after his bombshell trial a few months back. The trial where a jury of his peers may have found him guilty of those charges, but not guilty of sex trafficking and racketeering conspiracy, which, by the way, carried really significant prison time. Here, for the charges that he was convicted of, he faces a maximum of 10 years in prison on each charge, although most legal analysts would suggest that is highly unlikely that that's what he would receive. I will tell you that, but federal prosecutors, they have previously suggested 4 to 5 years in prison. They may ask for even more. Combs' defense team has asked for around 14 months, and after already sitting in federal lockup at the Metropolitan Detention Center since September of 2024, he's always been denied bail. If the judge sides with the defense's recommendation, then Combs would be essentially released immediately. And by the way, just real quick, we're going to talk about what happened today, but I want to highlight something about the sentencing before we talk about what happened today. So his attorneys submitted a 182-page sentencing memo laying out their argument for a lesser sentence. They go into Combs' history and upbringing by discussing how his father was shot to death, that this had a tremendous impact on Sean Combs' life, how he has had this dedication to his family and career and built a family for his colleagues and friends out of his business, how he has been an inspiration to others.
So if you want to make a
like drug use and addiction and certain medical conditions that were redacted in this filing, but that may all play a role in his anger. And we know the defense definitely tried to explain away a lot of those angry moments, right? The infamous Cassie Ventura beating, that video back in 2016. The defense went into what he was convicted of, how it doesn't warrant significant prison time, that Cassie Ventura and Jane, the key victims and accusers in this case, were part of a consensual sexual relationship with Sean Combs. That's the argument. I mean, and remember, he wasn't convicted of sex trafficking, despite the evidence of freak-offs and wild king nights. So the defense hammers home that there was no force, fraud, or coercion, that the male escorts that make up the transportation to engage in prostitution convictions, they were freely consenting to what happened. They argue, quote, "This is the only case we've identified where the government claims professional, consenting adult males were Mann Act victims." The Mann Act refers to transportation to engage in prostitution. They emphasize, and by the way, this comes up again today, that Combs didn't earn any money as part of this prostitution. They emphasize how the guidelines say 6 to 12 months should be the sentence, how the court cannot use any evidence from the racketeering or sex trafficking parts of the case in sentencing him for prostitution, that it would be unconstitutional. They fought back on the enhancers that prosecutors have argued for a more strict sentence. They can't argue fraud, coercion, that Combs wasn't a leader or organizer. And again, they say, look at what he was acquitted of. That would suggest that. And they argue, look, he has already experienced enough punishment by sitting at the notoriously bad MDC for over a year. So they argue for a 14-month sentence. And by the way, in anticipation of sentencing, people have submitted letters of support for Sean Combs to the court. You have a letter from his mother, Janice Combs, who writes in part, "I'm writing this letter to implore your honor to please have mercy on my son. Sean has always been a loving and caring son. On December 21st, I will be 85 years old." Goes on, "I would like to be able to spend the last few years of my life with my son, Sean. Unfortunately, my son has made some terrible mistakes in his life, which I know he recognizes." His adopted sister, Keisha Combs, wrote, "I pray that this moment is not the end of Sean's story, but a turning point toward a more purposeful and honorable life." You even have letters from fellow inmates. You have one from a Raymond Castillo, who writes, "Mr. Combs has saved me, not only striving to better himself, but to better everyone he encounters as a whole and leave a positive impact in everyone's life. Even behind bars and with limited resources, I've witnessed this man do magical things. In a place of segregation, I've seen Mr. Combs bring unity to all races and ethnic groups, no matter the background, as a united front." You have another inmate who writes, "Because of Mr. Combs, everybody in the unit is treating and acting positively towards each other, and for many people, that's a step forward in becoming a better person for when they get out of prison." So with all of that in mind, right, that's sentencing. Is it even going to happen, or is his convictions going to be thrown out? Because we got to talk about what happened in today's hearing, where Combs tried to get those convictions thrown out. And for that, let me bring on, once again, Law and Crime Network's reporter, Elizabeth Milner. Elizabeth, so good to see you. Get a chance to talk about this again. It's been a few months.
Right?
Thank you so much. First of all, it was a crazy scene getting in. There was a lot of people who tried to, right? You were there since like 6 a.m.
Yes, I was there bright and early, 6:30 a.m., got there, and there was already a line. Now, it was mainly a lot of press, but then we had this moment where we could just like put our names down on a list, come back later, and then when I came back, it was just so many more people. And I was surprised to see how much interest they had for just kind of what I felt to be like a standard procedural hearing, but so many people, I think, wanted to get one of their final glimpses of Sean Combs before he eventually learns his fate.
Yeah, and how did he look? Because we have the courtroom sketches. In my opinion, he looks skinnier.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Now, I don't want anyone to mistake what I had said, like I did last year with astonishingly thin, none of that. But I did feel like he did look slimmer from trial, but I did think he was kind of in an oversized MDC jumpsuit, which I was really surprised he was wearing, as opposed to kind of what had been ordered by the judge, which was the sweaters, the slacks, all of that stuff. So he came in the tan khaki suit. He kind of beamed up with smiles. I was surprised given how long it's been since he's seen probably all of us, but I think it was more so the smiles for his family.
His family was there?
His family was there, and the entire family too. So that included Keisha Combs, LaWanda Lane, who's been kind of taking care of the twin girls while Sean Combs has been incarcerated. Sarah Chapman, who is the mother of Chance Combs. Chance Combs was there. The twins were there. Janice Combs, Sean Combs' mother, was there. Charlucci, who's been a fixture every single day of trial.
And had him on sidebar.
Yeah, we've had him on sidebar. I've interviewed him, and so he was there, as well as Quincy Brown, Justin Combs, Christian Combs, and Christian Combs' girlfriend. So it was a really pretty stacked, and that was just excluding that was just including the family. There were still some loved ones there to support too.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked out of a meeting and you thought, wait a minute, what did we just decide after all? Around this motion for judgment of acquittal. It's basically when a defense counsel says, look, there was not enough evidence to convict this person. And this is regarding the two convictions that he got, right? 2 charges of transportation to engage in prostitution. I mean, it basically says what it is. It's transporting people across state lines for the purposes and internationalized for the purposes of sex work. There doesn't have to be force, fraud, or coercion. It was literally transporting men, Cassie, Jane, that's it. Okay, first issue I understand was about the timing of that motion, right? What happened there?
Yeah, so initially the government was kind of making the argument here, and it was first starting off with Meredith Foster, because I think a lot of people have to remember the lead prosecutor in this case, Maureen Comey, was no longer there because she's been dismissed from her job, which has been reportedly nothing to do with this case or anything like that. That's another story for another day. But Meredith Foster was making these arguments for the government, and it seems like at first they were kind of talking about challenging the jury instruction, particularly, and they cited some cases, one from 2025, USA versus Kelly, and how the defendant in that case argued on appeal that it was unconstitutionally vague for Mann Act and RICO conspiracy. But the government was pretty much arguing that this should have been raised pre-trial. They were citing cases from 2003, 1973, just about the broader concerns. But the government was saying it felt like the defense was kind of taking a second bite of the apple. They were encouraging, or the government was saying that the defense is encouraging the defendant to raise these claims afterwards. It says that the defense didn't raise these issues until even after trial, and it says that it should have been kind of raised during the indictment phase. Whereas Alexandra Shapiro, who was making the defense arguments, she was saying that the law on Rule 12 is extremely restrictive, and she says that there's no way to make this argument at an earlier point because this was kind of a result of the acquittal, because he was found not guilty of RICO conspiracy and sex trafficking, victim 1, and Jane, victim 1 being Cassie Ventura. And so the defense was saying that they were unable to make that argument any earlier, and so they were kind of trying to do it now because that was the most appropriate time for them.
You put that to the side about the timing. The judge says, okay, put the timing aside, I go now to the substance, whether or not there are substantive real grounds to throw these convictions out. One of the arguments, and I have to say a lot of these have actually been consistent with arguments that were made in prior filings by the defense.
If you're a trader living in the UK,
Holmes didn't make any money off of this prostitution, or he didn't pay for it himself, right? There's like a commercial aspect argument. What did they say?
Yeah, so initially they were going to be asking kind of 4 questions, then that both sides had to answer these questions. So this was brought up during question 2 about whether or not the Mann Act prosecution had a financial motive and whether or not the defendant kind of fall under the second liability, which is something I completely didn't know about because I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. But it was interesting kind of hearing those arguments. So the defense, starting off, that also being Alexandra Shapiro, she was saying that the statute should be construed narrowly to pimps and prostitution. She said that Mr. Combs was an alleged consumer and that this is just kind of a wire type of case. And it seemed like that's what the defense's whole argument was, that he was just financially giving the money, but it wasn't that he was necessarily making the money. And so the judge said, well, why wouldn't Combs be liable for willfully, under that willfully causing theory? And the defense said no, because it's talking about the transportation aspect and the mens rea that people would engage.
Intent.
Yes, exactly. And the intent that people would engage in prostitution, you can't say that he's willfully doing that necessarily because he, in essence, was just watching 2 people have sex, pretty much. And so the defense was talking about the money aspect and how they previously argued that, the money was for time. It wasn't necessarily for sexual purposes. It wasn't that typical pimp prostitute situation like that they were trying to make that comparison to. And so the defense was saying that it seems to imply that Sean Combs' conviction was based off the money transaction. Because if you remember from those summary flight charts, it was very easy for the jury to draw those conclusions about this is how much money was paid. This is what this when this flight happened, and the jury found in essence that when these hotel nights were happening, that this was for pretty much the process of transporting people across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. Whereas the government was saying that the conviction should still stand, that the defense is challenging the vagueness and the definition of prostitution specifically. And so the government said that this issue isn't whether the defendant himself engaged in prostitution and specifically in sexual acts, it's whether the defendant transported a person across state lines or international lines for the purposes of sex. And so the government argued that he facilitated the transportation with intent. And even though Cassie and Jane, and that's kind of where that first liability, secondary liability come in, where Cassie and Jane were the ones that the government was kind of saying were the ones who were contacting these entertainers or these escorts. But it was Diddy or Sean Combs who had that second liability because he watched, but he also provided the money.
Like he aided and abetted
Yes,
it in a way.
exactly. And so they argued
because it's not like a traditional case where someone, had this organization that was shipping off prostitutes to different people and this wide network. Yeah, but that's not necessarily what's required of this law. It's, did you transport people across lines for the purposes of sex work?
Right.
And I hear that, and I hear that argument.
And
yeah.
Of government interest. They say it's important to discourage violence against women, illegal drug use, preventing sexual assault. And they say within all 50 states, there are laws regulating prostitution in all 50 states, depending on which state you're in, determine if there is a substantial issue. And so the government was arguing that prohibiting transportation can help with the goal of thwarting prostitution, because I know people and the defense specifically have kind of just been chalking up the case to this is just a private matter, this is what's going on, and the government's trying to police what's going on in adults' bedroom. And so the defense said, well, this is expressive conduct that's protected by the First Amendment, and that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and their policy confirming as such. That's what the defense was arguing. And so judge's mind or anything like that. It seems like he's leaning toward possibly leaning towards no on the defense motions. I feel like sentencing will go on as usual on October 3rd. And the reason I say that is because he said, I'll see you guys next Friday. So I think he already has in his mind that sentencing will go forward. But whether or not he'll side with the defense at sentencing or the government at sentencing will be interesting.
So 2 points there. A, he